In nearly 2 years of covering Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, I have developed a pretty sophisticated meter for detecting Russian propaganda and BS. And the recent controversy between the so-called transgender boxer and in the Olympics smells like Russian nonsense. Just how did I come to this conclusion, and what does it mean for Russia? And why is Russia so involved in boxers' gender? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this story came up on my radar when something unusual happened in what's already kind of a weird and frankly dumb controversy, right? This is the Olympic boxer who quit abruptly just 46 seconds into her bout on the world stage is receiving a massive payout. But it's not from the International Olympic Committee. No, the International Boxing Association is going to be giving her a $50,000 check, the sum she would have pocketed had she emerged victorious and claimed the gold. And by women's boxing standards, that is a massive, massive payday, particularly for an Italian boxer, right? Someone where the average or the median income in Italy is while higher than a lot of countries, still something in the, I think, $30,000 range. So a huge payday, and very unusual to just give it to a boxer who is particularly one who kind of quit in sort of quit mid competition. But this is not the only weird thing that the IBA has done. And the IBA, once we crack this open, you're going to see why I think this starts to smell like some Russian nonsense. So, who is the IBA? Well, the IBA used to be the International Boxing Association. This was the head organization in charge of the sport of boxing. But over the last maybe 8 years, it's been increasingly taken over by Russia. And in fact, we've seen a lot of bizarre judging scandals, leadership changes, and of straight up financial fraud in the organization. But in 2019, well, actually, about 6 years ago, what the IBA, used to be known as the AIBA, was elected Garfur Rakhimazov, an Uzbek businessman who the U.S. called an organized crime boss. So again, a criminal oligarch was elected as the head. This was 6 years ago. And he stayed in place until about 2019, where he resigned after the IOC suspended ties with the organization. But that isn't all. The U.S., the new leader, the U.S. has said has deep ties to Russian organized crime and heroin trafficking, right? This is, of course, a reference to Putin acquaintance. Let's see, here he is, Umar Kremlev. You can see here he is pictured with Putin. And this guy took over the IBA so much so that he changed its name and moved the headquarters and most of the operations of the IBA to Russia, right? Centralizing control of the International Boxing Association under Russian auspices. And then, while most of these international sport bodies are funded by their member countries, boxing associations or wrestling associations or skiing associations or whatever the sport is, the IBA was bankrolled by Gazprom. Gazprom is interesting because it is the state oil company of Russia, right? Because remember, the IBA is supposed to be an international neutral organization administering all of boxing. But how can it be neutral if it's headquartered in Russia, headed by an organized crime boss of Russian origin, and sponsored by not the Russian government, a company owned by the Russian government? Of course, when the IBA, the few remaining member countries, tried to boot the guy out by electing a new president, he just said, yeah, you guys can't run elections. Cementing, of course, his control over the IBA. Now, in desperation to not have boxing run by criminals, most Western teams have actually left the IBA and created World Boxing, a new governing body, desperate to try to keep the boxing itself in the 2028 Olympics. Again, because the Olympics are like, we cannot have organized crime. We cannot have an organized crime organization running our events. You can imagine how the IBA feels about this, right? And they say, or how the IBA feels about being kicked out of the Olympics and told that basically no one wants to run or fight in events operated by them. And we can see why. Because the boxer who withdrew just a few seconds into her bout, well, there's a little bit of a problem that has emerged. First, that the allegations that this boxer failed an eligibility test are pretty strange because they come from the IBA. Now, the IBA came out and they didn't say exactly what test they gave, but they said, hey, this boxer, Imane Khalif failed a gender eligibility test. But here's the thing. The eligibility test wasn't administered before the competition, which is where you usually check the eligibility of an athlete. That's sort of, by definition, how eligibility works. Instead, the test was done 3 days after the boxer fought and notably beat a top-ranked, undefeated Russian prospect. And conveniently, because Khalif was deemed ineligible to have ever fought, thanks to this test, which, by the way, the IBA has never said what the test is, now the Russian boxer, she's back to being undefeated. How convenient, guys, for the IBA. But of course, they're neutral, guys. They would never do something inappropriate to back a Russian athlete. They're a totally neutral organization, just funded by the Russian government, headquartered in Russia, and headed by a member of the Russian oligarchs. But here's the thing. Let's say, for example, they did say, listen, we think this person is committing fraud. The boxer Khalif, sure, she said, I'm not trans. Sure, her family has said she's not trans. Sure, she's put out photographs of her as a little girl, 8 years old, wearing a dress in Algeria, which you may note is a country where being trans or even gay is highly illegal. Maybe that's all nonsense. Maybe that's all a smokescreen. And the IBA really did find something. What they would do is tell the IOC what they found. But no one has done that. They have just said some vague failed an eligibility test, which is nonsense. The reason, and I want you to compare it for a moment with an earlier controversy that happened, I think, 2 years ago in the United States, where a swimmer competing at the NCAA championships who was trans won the NCAA championships in pretty spectacular fashion. And the difference is, in that instance, one, the athlete themselves said, I'm trans. I used to swim as a male until like 2 years ago, 2 years before the competition. Now I'm swimming as a female. Two, the NCAA said, this is the exact test and parameters we use. They were public. They said, we tested them along these parameters. This is how the athletes' numbers were. Therefore, they were eligible to compete. So it was not a vague, well, we did a test. We can't tell you about it, but we promise we did a real scientific test, and it said negative. You know, the NCAA was very transparent. And the reason is because that issue seemed legit. Now, there's a larger question here, right? Right. The IBA, obviously, I'm going to stop dancing around the issues. The IBA, in all likelihood, wants to humiliate the IOC, and it wants to create a culture war controversy, try to spread it among Western countries. Now, why does the IBA and really Russia want to humiliate the IOC? Well, before we get into that, if you are hoping that, if you need the energy to take on your challenges, you may not get a $50,000 payday from the Russian government. You may just need to power through your challenges. If that's the case, man, you could check out some Strike Gum. This bad boy is the energy drink alternative. 90 milligrams caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, zero sugar. Best of all, it's made in the USA, right down in Denver. So you're not bankrolling some factory in China or Russia. It's obviously veteran owned. And it is vastly cheaper than the $5 energy drinks that you get at the gas station. And with literally 4.9 and 5-star reviews on Amazon, it's a no-brainer. This is the superior energy drink alternative. So you can go to strikegum.com. That's where you can get your military discounts, your first-time customer discounts. But you can also go to Amazon. Just search Strike Gum on Amazon. You can get it right there. So check it out. Thanks to the thousands of people that have ordered it. I really appreciate you. But let's talk about why the Kremlin is so goddamn pissed at the IOC. Well, the answer is because of what they call AINs. AIN isn't just a tax term. An AIN is French for neutral independent athlete. The reason is because the Russians pissed off the IOC once when they were found to be systematically doping all their athletes and committing a serious fraud, right? There was a big documentary about it. And then Russia further pissed off the IOC by invading their neighbor for no reason. And traditionally, when a country invades someone else for no reason, the IOC gives them the boot. And that is the case of the Russians. Now that they've invaded Ukraine, the IOC has said, Russia, you're out. But your athletes, you guys can compete, but you have to meet certain conditions. The first of which is you have to be considered an independent, neutral athlete. You cannot represent Russia. You can't play the Russian national anthem if you win. You can't wear Russian colors. You cannot wear Russian jerseys. And most infuriating to Russia is that you can't beat other countries, right? Like you're not competing on behalf of the Russian state. So to Russia, this is a massive humiliation, right? We know that Putin, and like a lot of autocrats, loves the Olympics. He loves it because it's a chance to show off what he is capable of when you don't have things like human rights or playing by the rules. When you're not subject to that, you can really do a lot. And so the fact that Russia cannot do this has them infuriated. So much so that the Kremlin spokesperson, as quoted by the official Russian state news agency, just has to weigh in on this issue. And this should tell you, this to me is the icing on the cake. Because remember, officially, the Russian government has nothing to do with the IBA. It has nothing to do with Olympic boxing. It has no athletes in this Olympics. And yet, they're putting out articles like this. One, the Olympic Games have become a platform for promoting liberal ideals that border on extreme, Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Friday, commenting on a boxing match between a female athlete and a transgender boxer. Again, the boxer herself is like, I'm not trans, guys. I don't know where you got this idea. All I did was beat up a Russian and then they humiliated me for it. Of course, they're saying that the article reminds us, again, this is the Russian state news agency, a news bringing in the wake of a controversial women's boxing bout at the 2024 Summer Olympic Games between Italian fighter Angela Carini and Algeria's Iman Khalif, who earlier failed an unspecified gender eligibility test, but was nonetheless cleared to compete at the 2024 Olympics in Paris. You notice they're deliberately obfuscating this. They failed an unspecified gender eligibility test administered by the IBA after she beat a Russian boxer. And then was cleared to compete at the 2024 Olympics in Paris because because she's not trans, because she's not doing anything wrong. And then he says, I didn't watch the fight, but listen to this. This is the most insecure. This outs the entire Russian stance on the Olympics. He says, quote, the international Olympic movement is losing face, becoming a victim of pseudo-liberal manifestations, which sometimes border on perversion. He continues, we would definitely still prefer to see the good old International Olympic Committee with the good old ideals of Olympism and the classical Olympic worldview, in which Russian athletes also played a significant role. However, these times, unfortunately, are long gone. So there's your answer, guys. The Russians are in full seethe and cope mode. Their goal is to just humiliate the Olympics in any way possible. And if they can't find a legitimate way to humiliate them, then they're going to pull out all the stops and just make shit up. Of course, that's because this is probably, without the Russian team, one of the cleanest Olympics, we've had in many, many years. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, Bill Collier, Robin Colburn, Gars Marning, Eugenia Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, and Fran Zacharias, and all the Lieutenant tier members. Could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.